This report's useful to leaders because it helps them prioritize their investments. So helping them understand where to focus their team and effectively rise to meet the threats that are most likely to harm their business.
That's one of the things that we tried to work on in this year's report, was trying to correlate where do we see certain activity happening in conjunction with other activity, like bringing those TTPs together and getting that back to like, okay, well, why does that happen? Well, it's because certain threats are using these tools together.
When you get to a practitioner level, there's a lot of time that you have to do a lot of other things. You have to close tickets, you have to put out fires, and the best gift that we could give somebody is an actionable lead to save them some time before they, bad guys come knocking on their door.
From the broadest level, I think that the report, if you think about why those 10 techniques are there, it sort of mirrors the increasing prevalence of threats that are worm-like, so things like NotPetya and WannaCry that move laterally in an environment seem to sort of dominate this list. So you see a lot of techniques that are related to things like Eternal Blue and things like TrickBot.
Looks like we have a quorum of folks joining. So welcome everyone. Thank you so much for joining our webinar today on the 2020 Threat Detection Report. We realize this is a really tough time for a lot of people, a lot of changes in everyone's lives, but we're really happy that you're able to join us. Threats aren't stopping, so neither should we. So we're excited for you to join us today for us to share the findings from this year's threat detection report, what threats have been up to, what some of the prevalent attack techniques are that have been going on. So thanks so much for joining us. To answer the obvious question, yes, this is recorded. We'll send out a recording early next week for everyone. We'll send out the slides, all of that for you all. So that's our most common question. We'll get that one out of the way up front. Let's dive right in. My name is Katie Nichols. I'm going to be your moderator today. I'm a principal intelligence analyst here at Red Canary. Been here since January, and I think of my job as sort of bringing context and connecting all the badness that we see. Prior to that, I was a member of the MITER attack team, so it was awesome last year, joined one of these webinars as a panelist. So it's my pleasure to be back today as your moderator. So I'll have each of our panelists, each of my teammates introduce themselves, kicking off with Keith. Keith, how's it going?
Hi, everybody. Thank you all. Yeah, just would echo what you said, and thanks to everyone for taking the time to join. Really appreciate it. Excited to share this and just hopefully have a good discussion.
Yep. Thanks, Keith. All right, Keith, one of the co-founders, of course, of Red Canary. Next up, Brian. How are you today, Brian?
Good. Hello, everybody. I'm Brian Donahue. For the last 6 months or so, my job has primarily been writing this report. Otherwise, I sort of help us with our blog, with research production and all sorts of stuff that has to do with publishing research.
Awesome. Thanks, Brian. And last but certainly not least, Tony. How are you today, Tony?
Good. I'm Tony. I've been at Red Canary for about 2.5 years, first as a detection engineer and then now on the Intel team. And most of my job for the last 6 months has been answering Brian's questions for the report.
A lot of folks who focused on this report, obviously Tony, Brian, Keith, just 3 of the folks at Red Canary. It's been really a team effort, as all of you, I'm sure, are aware. It takes a team to do this kind of thing. So we're really glad everyone's able to join today. You can follow along if you're a Twitter fan like I am. Hashtag RedCanaryTDR. The team will be tweeting out during the webinar. Feel free to do that as well. If you have any questions, feel free to use that Q&A panel that's in Zoom. That'll let us kind of rack and stack, and we'll try to get to as many questions as you have during the webinar. Good question to kick things off, a little introspection. Why do this? So Keith, as one of the founders of Red Canary, this takes a lot of time. As everyone kind of mentioned, this has been Brian's job for a few months. Why produce this report at all? Why does it help?
Yeah, great question. So, it's funny, as we were reflecting on this, over the course of the past few months, really, Brian reflecting maybe more than most. One of the things, I kind of remember fondly the day that attack went from this great idea that, you and Blake and the rest of the team had and kind of was, given unto the world. And we looked at that at Red Canary and realized like immediately, hey, this is like, we have a model for describing techniques and tactics. It was a vast improvement. And so we immediately dove headlong into, adoption of attack, building that into our detection systems, starting to build in the groundwork for today, what is like an incredible intelligence program. And we're a company of engineers. And so we went in like, did some design, went into implementation, and then we kind of got through the initial crush of it and took a step back and said, all right, like now what, right? How do we think about, whether our attack coverage is adequate? How do we prioritize what we do next? And then as we started to talk to customers and the community in general, that became like the prevailing question, right? Like, where do I get started? Attack is this amazing like corpus of information, but it's flat, right? And so as a member of the community or a security operations team lead or an intelligence practitioner, like it's really hard to understand where to get started. And so we thought about that for a long time, right? And internally it got some headway with respect to like operations, right? So prioritizing things for our detection engineering team. And then we kind of took a step back one day and realized, hey, like we've got this incredibly unique view, an incredibly unique perspective into these techniques, right? We are day in, day out doing security operations work like with our customers. And so we, in the sense that some reports are very incident response focused, right? Like focusing on analyzing things that have happened and then have been dissected. We see some of that, but we've got this incredible like ongoing living view of how these techniques are, appearing, evolving, and what those trends look like over time. And so, the question at the top is the one I think that we really set out to answer, both for ourselves and for like the broader community, right? Just how do we get started? And you can kind of see as we flow through this, how we like the approach that we've taken over time to like answer the right questions, right? How do we detect these things? What are the trends? What visibility do I need in order to put myself in a good position as an enterprise? And that's it. I mean, I think that, how do I get started, I think is the quintessential question, and like what we hope to help everyone kind of, never going to be answered definitively, but we hope this report serves as like a great jumping off point. So.
Yeah, well said. When I was on the attack team, I got that question all the time. How do I get started with all of these techniques? And you said a couple things, prioritizing, prioritizing based on what real threats are doing. And we have that visibility at Red Canary, so why not share that out? So awesome. Thanks, Keith. Always good to start with the, why are we doing this? The so what? Here's how we're going to organize today's webinar. We're going to first talk to you about what's in the report. We will be sharing out the link to that at the end of the webinar, because if we shared it now, you'd just be reading it and not listening to us. So we'll share that with everyone in chat at the end of the webinar. We'll give you kind of a feel of what to expect. The report format's a little bit different. Then we'll dive into some of the trends. Based on our research and visibility, what have we seen that adversaries and threats are up to over the past year? And maybe some of those things will continue, maybe they'll change. And then lastly, we want you to be able to put this into action. So we're going to talk about use cases for 3 kind of key groups of people. How do you action this report? Because that's the whole point of this. It's not just a report to make us feel good. It's for you to take action in your organization. So that's how we'll organize today's webinar. The whole point of this, Keith talked about prioritization. We want you to be able to focus on the techniques and the things adversaries are doing that really matter. And so with that in mind, I'm gonna have Brian kind of walk you through what data have we used to get the information in this report, what kind of visibility do we have, and give you a preview of what the report looks like. So Brian, over to you.
Thanks. So in order to understand the report, you kind of have to understand the data that we used to create the report. And if you want to understand that, then you have to have at least a minimum understanding of what Red Canary does and how Red Canary does it. So from the broadest level, Red Canary does managed detection and response. And our particular flavor of managed detection and response is largely focused on endpoints. So all of our customers have an endpoint detection and response agent installed on their machines, and those agents forward telemetry into our platform. So to give you an idea of the scope of that, and like these numbers are slightly out of date now, but they are accurate for the period of time on which the report is based, which is 2019. So throughout 2019, on average, we were parsing roughly 200 billion pieces of endpoint telemetry per day. So to put that another way, we were ingesting basically 115 or so terabytes of telemetry on a daily basis. So that all gets forwarded into our platform. And our platform also has a variety of detection criteria built into it that are developed by our detection engineering team. So it's roughly 1,500 or so behavioral analytics that parse through this endpoint data and look for matches. So to give you like a concrete example of what that might be, if a process rather that is Microsoft Word launches a process that is like or appears to be PowerShell, that's something that we may want to raise up for an investigation by our detection engineering team. So our detection engineers will then investigate that event with a variety of contexts built around it. And if they determine that it is indeed malicious, then we will ship a confirmed threat detection off to our customers. So like to be very clear, with like 99.9% certainty, if we ship a detection to a customer, it is malicious. So those confirmed threat detections include a variety of information, just trying to give the customer as much context as we possibly can. For the purposes of this discussion, like the most critical piece of information that's included in a threat detection is that we attempt to map all of these behaviors back to a MITER attack technique. So each of those 15,000 confirmed threat detections will include one or more, like can be many, attack techniques that are associated with them. And then like broad level, to build this report, we essentially counted attack techniques to try and figure out which ones are happening and like which ones are most prevalent across our customer set. Now, a couple caveats here, like 15,000 is just malicious threats. Not included in this report or in that number are any detections that we've shipped to our customers associated with things like potentially unwanted programs and adware. So these 15,000 confirmed threats create a prevalence list. And if we jump into the next slide, we can sort of talk more about that. So this prevalence list, which is most clear as a top 10 of the most common attack techniques we see, that sort of structures the report. But each of those top techniques is actually given its own technique-specific section in the report. And that section is going to try to answer a couple of questions about each technique. So it's going to answer why do adversaries use this technique? How do adversaries use this technique? What are the collection sources that you need to be collecting log data from in order to observe this technique? And then lastly, how can you actually detect this technique? So like that's going to be the structure, and you'll see it in a second when we jump into the report. But sort of other things that are included within our analysis in this report are things like year-over-year trending. So how are these techniques moving up or down in prevalence from 2018 to 2019? One of the things that I think is most interesting about this year's report is this idea of co-occurrence. So like we all know that threats don't occur in isolation, right? Like threats are generally parts of attacks and attacks are parts of campaigns. But even on that bottom level, the threat level, like any given threat is going to be made up of many behaviors. So going back to the example I just used when we were discussing behavioral analytics, like if Microsoft Word launches PowerShell, within our mapping, that's probably going to be tagged both with spear phishing attachment and with PowerShell. So beyond those things though, like when we were talking about how we wanted to count threats, we obviously landed ultimately on like, we're just going to count by raw threat volume. But we had some arguments about what prevalence really means. And one of the things that like one of the ways we thought about going with this was maybe prevalence actually means like the most prevalent threat is the threat that affects the most people. So in addition to counting by total threat volume, we made a second list and we counted by the number of customers that were affected by each technique. And while the top 10 was like different in order, pretty dramatically different in order, it was mostly the same in terms of the threats. There were 3 additional threats that were included in the top 10 when we counted by the number of customers affected that were not in the other top 10. So this additional research section has basically become a way for us to say, if we want to add more analysis to the report throughout the year, and it's a completely digital report, so we can update it whenever we want. So if we want to add more techniques throughout the year, we have the ability to do that. And starting today, we're actually releasing 3 additional techniques that affected a wide array of customers, but didn't crack the top 10 in terms of total threat volume. So if you scroll to the back end of the report, you'll notice that we have sections for credential dumping, Windows management instrumentation, and spear phishing with spear phishing attachments. So,
yeah, and Brian, I think that's super important. Anyone who's trying to do this kind of counting based on attack techniques, that consideration of the methodology is so important because, as you said, depending on how you count based on customer environments affected or based on just the number of detections, the top 10 changes. But I think what I've always said is, hey, those things are still happening in confirmed threats, so they matter. It's just maybe your top techniques change a little bit. So I think that's really important context for anyone who's considering counting by attack to have.
Yeah, exactly. And if we jump onto the next, take a sort of how this all plays out in the actual report. So this is the page that most people are going to first see when they enter the report. We've already covered a lot of what's on it, so I want to actually go straight to the prevalence list. And this page is for the most part, it's navigational, but it might also be useful if you're maybe a security leader and you want to just see from a very high level, like what's happening most according to our visibility. And then maybe you can even go back to your team and ask them questions like, hey, Red Canary says process injection is the most common attack technique. What does our detection coverage look like for that? Each of these are clickable, or most of them are clickable, and they'll take you to a technique specific page. Another way to think about this sort of detection coverage from a high level is to go to the industries tab here. So here you can sort the top 10 based on industry. So if you work for a bank, maybe you want to see what this looks like just for finance. Again, here, this is also navigational. So as I scroll over Windows admin shares here, it flips to black. If it flips from red to black, that means we've written an analysis section on it. See, service execution doesn't because we haven't written an analysis section on that yet. So as I said, process injection is number 1. So let's click through there and look what each technique page looks like. So it's broken into 3 sections: analysis, definition, and detection. We start with a lead. And this lead here is going to try and explain from a high level why process injection is number 1. In this case, it's mostly because TrickBot uses it to execute arbitrary code. As we scroll down, we're going to get into the analysis section, which I think is probably most useful for analysts. And we're going to ask 2 basic questions, like why do adversaries use this and how do they use this? And under the how section, we're going to go into sort of the specific ways that an adversary might use a technique like process injection. We're also going to call out specific threat groups, specific malware families that are known to use process injection. As we continue to scroll down, you'll note a cited with section. And this is where we're going to talk about co-occurrence. So in this case, you'll see that process injection occurs most commonly with scheduled tasks. And the reason for that is because TrickBot often uses scheduled tasks to establish persistence. Now, the top analysis section and the bottom detection section are going to be broken up by a definition. This definition is pulled directly from MITER. If you click on it, you'll go right to the attack page for process injection. We also took these data sources from MITER. Now, these are the sources of data that MITER says you need to collect logs from if you want to be able to see these activities. So our collection requirements section is our assessment of those collection sources. So we're saying here, like, these are the best data sources to collect from if you want to observe process injection. And then in the detection suggestions section, we're going into like very specific detection criteria and behavioral analytics that you can build out to actually build out detection and reliably detect these things in your environment. Now, as a note, some of these detection criteria are going to be noisy. They're going to create false positives. So we end every section with like cautions about if you follow this to the letter of the law, you may run into these false positive problems. So that's basically what the layout of each specific technique section is going to look like in the report.
Awesome. Thanks, Brian. I know that last point, the weeding out false positives, is so important because we've all talked to people who are like, yeah, behavioral analytics, great thing to do. And then you get drowned by a million IP configs or whatever. So I think it's a really important thing. Those weeding out false positives, Tony's laughing because it's real life when you're doing this kind of work.
Only bad guys use who am I, right?
Of course, of course. And Keith, did you have something to jump in with as well?
Yeah, I mean, I was just going to say, kind of just thinking about the report this year compared to last year, and also thinking about it, alongside the great work that MITER has done to like just provide a framework for cataloging and describing this stuff. I think if there's a vision for this, like, and what we would love, like how we would love to see this used, as Red Canary and as a tool for the community, is like, this is effectively, the encyclopedia of these techniques, like not just the technique information themselves, but this format and, having it like the expanded content, like all those things work together to hopefully, be a really useful focal point. Like when you're thinking about a technique, understanding, what is this technique? How is it described? What does MITER say about it? But then having the context of, an operational team, to help you understand, how likely is it to happen, and how am I going to go about detecting it? What pitfalls am I going to run into? It's just, it's really exciting seeing this format come to life, and just, this kind of reimagining of the structure.
Yeah, absolutely. So as we promised, we'll give you the link at the end of the webinar. Thanks, Brian, for giving that preview of kind of what it looks like. I'm personally a fan of the website, kind of the interactive thing. And as Brian mentioned, our hope is to be able to update this throughout the year, which is part of the reason we made a website rather than a PDF. But rest assured, there's a PDF executive summary for all the PDF fans. All right, so with that understanding of kind of what the report is, where the data comes from, really important to frame this, let's dive into the trends that we've seen. Tony, Brian, Keith, many others on the team spent months and months kind of thinking about what are the trends we've seen over 2019, what are the threats really doing? So let's dive in a little bit deeper on that, starting with the top 10. Everyone loves the top 10 techniques, and Brian showed it to you briefly, but Keith, could you talk to us a little bit more about sort of why does the top 10 look like it looks?
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's, at a really high level, understanding why the top 10 looks the way that it does this year, and also thinking about, why it's changed from last year. Maybe the most important takeaway is that, while every single one of these techniques is important to understand at a low level, like on its own, the reason that the top 10, looked the way that it looked last year, and the way that it looks the way that it looks this year, is because, like, in every case, there have been, there are these kind of, there are one-off or emerging threats that occur over the course of any time period. And then there's this, there is this undercurrent, right? In this case, like in last year in particular, like that undercurrent was really consistent and really strong. And Tony's going to go into a bunch of detail and explain, a little bit more about, what those threats were, or like what that undercurrent consisted of. But I think that's, when we talk about like why the top 10 looks the way that it does, and as we reflect on each one of these things individually, it's super important to kind of, maintain that macro view, in that, Brian said it before, none of these things occur in isolation. Like even one piece of malware is going to exhibit a number of these behaviors. And so in the same sense, like this top 10 doesn't just appear out of thin air, right? It is the product of, a lot of adversary tactics that they're trying and seeing, they're seeing what sticks. And the things that stick, we can expect to see more of. And, last year's data was a really, really good, exemplification of that phenomenon. So I think that's, the framing that we'd like to go into this, this next section with is, why, like, what were the few things that led to pretty significant change over the course of the last year?
Awesome. Thanks, Keith. So with that idea of the top 10, let's dive a little deeper, thinking about the different phases of what adversaries do. So for that, we'll hand it over to Tony, who's one of the people that looks at these detections every day. It's kind of amazing seeing constantly what threats are up to. So Tony, walk us through a little bit of a deeper dive on what you've seen from threats doing this past year.
So over the past year, no matter what the threat was, it typically followed a relatively similar pattern, relatively similar life cycle, based on three pretty much like overarching phases. There's going to be an initial access, how our attacker gets in, how our adversary gets in. this is going to be the only real part of this process that differs, because what we saw for the rest of the year was that the last two phases pretty much stayed the same and were pretty rapid and pretty automatic. So it's usually followed by some form of how do we get around the environment, some sort of lateral movement. Where an adversary starts on a network is not the place that they're going to end up. Very rarely is an attacker's objective on the same machine that they land on. So they have to figure out a way to get around and about the network, and they have to figure out a way to monetize their efforts. They have to figure out a way to take what they have gained from this breach, what they've gained from this compromise, and turn it into cash. And we'll get into a little bit more specific of this, starting with some of the phishing threats that we saw from the last year. So the first major big kind of threat we saw for the last year, of course, was phishing. Phishing is all over the place. If you followed anything about Emotet or TrickBot in the last year, phishing is all over the place. It has got to be, without a doubt, one of the best ways to get malware into a network. If you're not familiar, like if you think that you're like watertight on phishing, please go back and check again, because this is something that happens in everybody's environment.
Hey, Tony, I have a quick question here. So I sort of alluded to this when we were going through actually looking at the report, but just to state it like completely frankly and honestly, our data in this report is like shaped in no small way by TrickBot engagements. So like the behaviors that TrickBot uses, you know, in its infections are like very prevalent in our top 10. Like many of them have to do with TrickBot. However, as I understand it, TrickBot is generally delivered by Emotet, and Emotet for the most part is delivered via phishing schemes. So why are we seeing so much more process injection and TrickBot related techniques and fewer Emotet related techniques?
It's an awesome, awesome question, awesome kind of insight in the middle of all of this, because we have the privilege of being a unique security organization where we take part in continuous monitoring operations, as well as helping with incident response engagements. So the beautiful thing about an incident response engagement is that you never know what stage of the life cycle for a malware family you're going to get dropped into the environment for. You may be dropped into the middle of an incident response engagement. Everything is on fire. You may get there and then everything's already been encrypted by ransomware. In the case of, you know, us seeing process injection and TrickBot so prevalently over the last year, most of the incident response engagements we saw with TrickBot happened later in the life cycle. At that point, you know, the spear phishing part had gone past. We're never going to get that data back. We're never going to see it because it's already happened. And we have to seize the opportunity that we do now to get into the middle of the lateral movement and detect lateral movement, detect the adversary's actions on objectives to get their, you know, their compromise further down the road.
Yeah, Tony, I think that, you know, on that point, like when we talked about visibility, you often hear this, like, do we need endpoint or do we need network? Like, which one should we have? And like, I think the answer is both, because, you know, you'll see our top 10 very heavily, you know, reliant on things we can see on the endpoint. Spear phishing, maybe if you're seeing network, you'll see that a little more prevalent. So I think it's important to think about like not just what's in our top 10, but what's not there, and realizing that, you know, it's important to bring in different visibility, different data sets, which would talk about the end with applying this to your own use cases, your own environment.
Absolutely.
Did you have something?
Yeah, no, I was gonna echo that. I think that's one of the things we've, you know, the prevalence is definitely a function of our visibility, right? And in this case, it's not visibility in the sense of, you know, detection coverage and things like that. It's just, you know, the data sources that we collect, right? And
Yep.
we chose endpoint data for a pretty specific reason, which is that, you know, it's not perfect, like you said, you need both, but it does happen to be the one that gives us like a really good cross-section of visibility. I think, you know, when we map our data sources, endpoint data gets us visibility into 80 to 85% of our MITER techniques. And then, yeah, it's super important to go as you kind of iterate and round out your program, think about how you close those remaining gaps. So.
Absolutely. So yeah, phishing super important, but not the only kind of way adversaries get in. How else do they get in, Tony?
So the other big thing that we saw for the year, and this has been kind of an ongoing trend, is figuring out different remote services, different public-facing applications that adversaries can access or exploit to get an initial foothold into the network. Most often we see this with SMB v1 and SMB version 1 and Eternal Blue. It's still a thing. We saw WannaCry in a couple of engagements this year. Surprised us, but hey, it's still a thing. And SMB version 1 is still a thing in numerous organizations, and we're still seeing it. And this last year, you probably noticed a little bit more along the lines of remote desktop protocol research. If you were in the news, you saw Bluekeep, you saw different things like that where people were figuring out new ways to exploit remote desktop applications, figure out, can these things be wormable? How can we use them as an initial access? Something like this, I tend to associate it more with like infrastructure type threats, whereas you might see phishing a little bit more with your frontline employees, something like that, the person that gets into Outlook at the morning, every morning, something like that. The horrible and beautiful thing about remote access services at the same time is that they're always up, they're always available, and they're always ready for an attacker to get into them no matter what the time of day is.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think this is something, I like the user perspective, the infrastructure perspective. And as so many teams are going remote, this is probably something to think about. We often think about the user, the awareness piece, but what do you have? What services do you have exposed, especially with that migration happening in so many teams? So really great point. I like that breakdown. So
if I might answer a question in the middle of that as well. One of the questions that I think we saw earlier was somebody asking, with a lot, especially with the recent weeks where we have a lot of folks working from home, working remotely, things like that, infrastructure is kind of a big target, and how can we kind of act to prevent that? And the best advice I can give in the middle of that is to figure out exactly which services you have available to the public internet, and if you can figure out a way to make those VPN only, if there's a way to sort of minimize that risk, that's going to be an awesome endeavor for you. A good example of that was this year, we ended up having one organization that had an SCCM server that was available on the public internet because they were using it in a cloud service. They had no idea that it was publicly available, so they didn't know to go to secure those services. That sort of thing becomes really important in the last few weeks.
Yeah, great points. And just having awareness of that infrastructure, but knowing kind of even what's on the slide, these are what the threats have been doing, helps you make those decisions in a changing environment for a lot of folks. Oh, yeah. Great point. So moving on to kind of the meat of this lateral movement, walk us through that, Tony.
So the biggest trend that we saw with the last year was that automatic lateral movement was pretty much automatic, pretty automated, really quickly. And it happened in a variety of ways. TrickBot, Emotet, several other malware threats can use SMB exploitation, other forms of exploitation to get around. But why burn an exploit? Why do something like that when you can just use legitimate credentials? In many cases in organizations we saw, legitimate credentials were either cracked, stolen, guessed, something else from various malware families, and those were used to get around automatically. In these cases, that can be something as simple as using WMI, like using a WMI command to spawn something else on another host. It could be something a little bit more complicated, like using Windows admin shares to copy a file and schedule a service. But all of it happened pretty rapidly, pretty automatically, and it leads to kind of a wildfire across your network in some ways, to where you have to figure out a way to quickly get a hold of the compromise and quickly stop it.
I like that wildfire term. And kind of thinking about this lateral movement, kind of the execution piece, one question that we had come in was on process injection. So putting you on the spot here, any use cases you can think of, maybe one you've talked about or a different one, that what threats have used process injection, and how do we identify that? I'm sure you've found that a few times. How do we go about doing that? What threats have been using process injection?
So the threats that tend to use process injection, they obviously use it as a defense evasion mechanism. They don't want to be found. And usually what ends up happening is they have taken a piece of code somehow and they're sticking it into another process to make it look like it's legitimate. Good couple of examples of this. TrickBot will do this and inject code into SVC host. Ryuk will do this in some versions of Ryuk. the encryption routines that were used to do the ransom encryption routines were injected into Windows system processes to make this happen. In some cases, like, people joke around with commodity malware like rats and things like that. Even rats can take advantage in some cases of process injection, because combining them with different tools can get them injected into Windows processes. Typically, if you're using EDR, syscall monitoring sort of solutions, it gets a little bit weird when you're looking at all the different kinds of process injection. There are so many different kinds. You have to really focus on one specific kind at a time and test it out and see what you can see in your environment. A quick and simple way that we've been able to kind of dial in on some things, usually when bad guys use process injection, they tend to use some sort of process that they're spawning immediately, then they inject content into it instead of injecting content into running processes. In these cases, they may choose something like SVC host. Let's see, what's another one? Windows error reporting or something else that typically has a specific command line that goes with it. And something we've been really successful with baselining in our environments is that we can figure out which processes typically have those longer command lines. And let's say if they don't have a command line at all, well, that's kind of a +1 towards the behavior of maybe this is process injection. If we see run DLL32 with no command line, and also it's doing network connections and other things like that, that's a pretty clear-cut sign for us that there's some sort of injection involved.
Yeah, and I think those are great detection suggestions. I know there's a lot of them on that technique page in the report. A tougher one, someone asked mitigation. How do we mitigate process injection? Can we, other than, of course, the default answer of application whitelisting, which is my go-to? Any thoughts on mitigation for process injection? Or Keith, if you have any thoughts on that as well?
Well, yeah, I mean, I was going to chime in a little bit on, specific detection techniques, which I think does kind of flow over into how you can mitigate those. But, I know that Tony mentioned just, the evolution of a lot of endpoint protection. Like, a lot of them are starting to instrument a little bit more deeply, particularly on the Windows platform, and how, for the first time, we've got access to a pretty good set of tools that when process injection occurs, don't just report it, but can actually look at that context, right? Should this process be talking to this other process? And one that's actually, a really unique product of how we've evolved our detection over time, and also used heavily for preventative controls or blocking is, not just should this process be talking to this other process, but that next level of context, which is, hey, what permissions did the initiating process request in the target? And I know, like, Tony shaking his head because, like, we went through
that's like, this was like thing.
This, we had this massive like corpus of data sitting there, and as we started to look at it, we realized, like, a while ago, there's this really tight correlation between requested access codes, which are, effectively the byte level representation of like a thing that one process is asking of another. There's a really tight correlation between those and particular pieces of malware or particular behaviors like going and accessing credentials. And so maybe that speaks a little bit to both, which is like that can lead to really successful detection. And that understanding is also like really, really invaluable for implementing preventative controls.
So one thing I wanted to add in for the preventative side of things was that typically when injection is involved, there's not a whole lot that you can do like to prevent injection in between, like, let's say something like Explorer in my user session and another process in my user session. But the boundary lines are typically when another user is involved. So, I can't inject something into Katie's processes or something like that. So where that becomes, really finicky is what happens if our bad guy gets into a system level account or a root account or, something where they can control all the processes on the system. So some of the big preventative measures are going to be to figure out, how do I restrict administrative access? How do I better protect my credentials? How do I better protect, people, bad guys from getting administrative access to a system? And how can I better patch my systems to make sure that there aren't as many privilege escalation flaws that I can go and get to the system account from?
Absolutely. Awesome recommendations for kind of process injection that, wipes out a lot of these other techniques adversaries are doing as well. So that was sort of on the kind of execution, lateral movement piece. Moving on to what I call where the rubber meets the road, kind of the impact tactic, or to use kill chain parlance, actions on objectives. What have we seen there, Tony? What trends have we seen?
So the biggest trends that we've seen, again, kind of looking at the phishing kind of threats, has been something like TrickBot, Ryuk, especially affecting like education, local government, things like that, where the larger kind of ransomware economy has gone beyond encrypting grandma's pictures and has gone towards, let's ransom an enterprise, let's ransom a network, let's make it hard for these people to do business, and then get them to pay us to go back to business. Some of that's been really big over the last year. That's kind of been an ongoing trend from previous years. And if it tends to not be that, maybe our bad guys are doing credential harvesting other kind of data to sell. Something that's been big in some circles this year is access as a service. It doesn't necessarily be that our bad guys accessing the systems right here, right now are doing the bad things. They could just be opening a door for somebody else. And in some cases, like in a small Monroe example I want to show in a little bit, it was resource hijacking, cryptocurrency mining. That's something that is very opportunistic, something that can happen, if you have an unsecured service on the internet for very long, chances are you're probably going to be mining something at the end of the day. We're just not sure what yet.
Yeah, so we see that kind of all over. We see a ton of ransomware. So again, thinking about what we see and don't see in the top 10, like none of these impact techniques are there. So one thing to think about there, well, the impact tactic was added to attack in April 2019, midway through the year. And so again, limitations of mapping to any framework. I'm just thinking about, those frameworks change over time, attack changes over time. So we'll kind of see maybe, in the future, maybe next year or over the year, we'll see kind of some of these impact techniques trending. And on that note, Keith, one question that we chatted about a little bit, how have these impact techniques changed a little bit? Like what trends are we seeing in terms of confidentiality, integrity, availability? How do you think that's going to change in the future?
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, I think that that triad is definitely a great way to frame, I think how we've seen that change. Tony mentioned it before, right? This started, ransomware began with, very opportunistic single system approach. So I lock up your computer, you give me a few $100, you get it back. It is, the last 2 years have been dominated by the trend that is, get a foothold, move laterally, and then lock up an entire enterprise, right? And so both of those, both the individual and the enterprise-wide approach, those are very clear availability attacks, right? I take away your ability to use the system, you pay me something to get it back. And, when we move from single system at a few $100 or now at the price of Bitcoin, it's a little bit higher, but you move to a full enterprise, that trend increased as you'd expect, right? Now you're into $20, $30, $40, $50, $60,000 to get your availability back. You talk about what's not represented in the top 10, and maybe what's not really well represented in impact now is the trend we've seen over the last 3 to 6 months, which is moving to attacks against confidentiality, right? So I have access to your systems, not necessarily just ransomware, although it's often used in conjunction with, ransomware becomes kind of a way to get your attention. What they really want now is not $30, $40, $50,000 to unlock the systems. They exfilled a bunch of data, right? And now, they might want $1 million in exchange for, what might be your most valuable IP getting dumped onto the internet. And so it's, those are the things, talked on the lead into this, the top 10 are important. This is a really, really good example of how critical it is to understand what adversaries want and how that's changing. Some of it's still very mechanical, right? Sometimes they still want access. Sometimes they still just want to lock things up and make a quick transaction. But, the costs and, how they think about success are, getting to be, the calculus for that is changing on both sides. And I think it's going to just lead to some really interesting discussions. And it's going to lead to some really a fundamentally different approach to risk management for a lot of organizations.
Absolutely. Brian, did you want to jump in here?
Yeah, just to dovetail quickly on something you said, like, yes, the framework is going to change, but the other thing that changes very frequently is our detection criteria. So, for example, DLL search order hijacking was the 75th most prevalent attack technique in our data set in 2018. We created a new behavioral analytic for detecting, I think it was Dridex, and all of a sudden, like, that shot from 75 to 8 or 9, I think. So, like, it's all in flux all the time, and like that leads to, and it has a lot to do with not only the way that MITER thinks about the threat landscape, but our visibility into it.
Absolutely. It'll be interesting to see kind of how these techniques change over time. We hope to be able to update that as threats change, as they do. So that was really diving into kind of the actions on objectives piece. So Tony, going back to a little bit of a deeper dive in terms of lateral movement and execution, walk us through some of the commands we've seen for different techniques.
Yeah, so for this one, we kind of wanted to expand a little bit on the theme of co-occurrence and kind of show a concrete example of what this looks like in real life. This threat that I'm showing is the Smallmanru botnet. It's something that was a cryptocurrency miner. You may have seen it associated with the name MyKings and other media, things like that. But over the next 3 slides, we're going to show like a big long command line that was like really huge, all one command. We had to break it down to show. And in this case, we were able to see that 3 or 4 multiple techniques co-occurred in just a single command. So in the first one, we could see WMI was used, Windows Management Instrumentation was used to not only persist a little bit with Windows Event subscriptions, that's even another technique in itself, to persist a little bit as well as execute using the WMI command. Then that was combined going next to PowerShell. In this case, PowerShell was used in a couple of different ways. PowerShell in this case was used combined with obfuscated data, obfuscated commands, and that's even another technique on its own. Like so far, like the ones that we're looking at that are called out fairly solid here are the ones that we would be detecting on, because it's harder for us to get the great amount of context around like all 50 or so techniques that may be in one specific threat. But so many of these techniques may go into just a single malware family. And then even following up on the final slide is, looking at remote file copy. In this case, PowerShell was used. Red Server 32 was used to pull down some content before it could execute. And it's just a bunch of different things all in one space, all in one command. And this kind of plays an important role in the detection report, because in this particular threat, PowerShell was used 2, 3 or more times. Even though it was used 2, 3 or more times in this specific detection, it was only counted once, simply because it's this threat included PowerShell. We're counting it once and we're moving on with our day. If we start doing that individual counting, it's going to bog everybody down. It's not going to have anybody have a good time. Yeah, it's everybody likes those granular statistics, but we're going after some actionable stuff to show you what works together, how do they enable each other, and how can we help everybody get better.
Absolutely. And I think looking for multiple techniques at once is a great way to maybe weed out some of those false positives. So thanks for that dive into what I'm going to call MyKings, because I can't say the Smallmanru name very well. So thanks, Tony, for that.
You did good on that one.
Thanks. Yeah, I can't say it again, though. Don't try me. So we've talked to you about some of the trends we saw as we did analysis. So next, most important section, how do you put this into action? Depending on where you are in your organization, how can you use this information for you? So we know there are a lot of different roles in cybersecurity. We've bucketed them into analysts, people who are looking at threats and detections every day, the architects who are setting up networks, collecting logs, and the leaders who have to empower everyone else in their teams. So let's kick off with analysts. Brian, you have a lot of experience as a threat intel analyst. You've looked at so many of these threats. How would you recommend that analysts action this report?
Yeah, so like maybe the first thing I would think about doing is kind of comparing notes. So look at what we're saying is prevalent across our customer base and see if you're seeing it in your environment. And if you're not seeing it in your environment, is it because it's not happening? Or perhaps is it because you don't have the visibility to see it? Another thing I like to think about, and we sort of got a question about this, is like always be thinking about your threat model, right? So a lot of people get wrapped around the wheel about like super sophisticated nation state level or state level, I should say, threat groups. So like, yes, if you make really good missiles, you should be concerned about militaries trying to steal your missile IP. But like, if you make tennis balls, maybe you don't need to be worried about that, right? And then like this whole report is about assessing priorities. So are you spending too much time on threats that aren't really relevant to you? Do you know what you're likely to face? And then maybe the most important of all of this is just about learning what to look for. So like understanding what malicious looks like in your environment in the telemetry. And just to answer a question we got really quickly, someone asked about if we have specific information about threat actors in here. The answer is yes. But I would also say like you should go and look at the information that MITER has about it, because they do have a great deal of information about the threat actors that leverage each of these techniques.
Oh, thanks, Brian. And luckily the team, I moved on, but the team's still kind of carrying that on at MITER. But yeah, in each of the techniques, you can kind of see a list of some of the different malware, different threat groups who've used that technique. Of course, that's always subject to change. But Brian, you said two of my favorite words, threat model. Every organization is going to have different threats. They're not distributed equally. So looking at the report, what threats we've seen, someone asked about the big three, MITER, TrickBot, and Ryuk. Should we worry about them in a smaller organization? Well, it depends, of course. That's my favorite answer as an analyst, but depends. Do you think you might see them? Often those are sort of opportunistic, so maybe they affect everyone, but again, thinking about what affects you. Tony, do you want to jump in here?
Absolutely. For the EMITED part, at the very least, that is something that is very opportunistic. It's going to go after organizations of any size, any resources, something that's along the lines of Ryuk as it goes down the line. Those are going to be enterprises. If you're mom and pop's flower shop, you may not be worried as much about Ryuk, but if you're a medical system, if you're a local government, then that's something that's definitely going to be on your radar.
Absolutely. So thinking about what threats matter to you, that's kind of the key there as analysts. Moving on, staying with Tony, you're both an analyst and an architect, Tony, but as someone who's had to deal with, what information do you collect, what logs do you collect, what recommendations do you have for people architecting or engineering a network on how they'd apply this report?
So the beautiful thing about architect positions is that if you're an IT architect, security architect, it's a largely thankless job that if you do your job right, you're going to enable your team and nobody's ever going to know that it was done well. So there are a few things that you can kind of take from all of this, take from the findings of the report, and go to make the thankless job a little bit better and help to make everybody a little bit happier. The first thing I want to kind of get out of the way is it's nice to look at reports. It's nice to get threat feeds. It's nice to get all of this stuff. But first and foremost, the best intelligence that you can have in your organization comes from the inside. The first thing that you want to do is go talk to your analysts, go talk to your IT people, go talk to everybody that you can that's a stakeholder here, and figure out what threats they're worried about, what keeps them up at night, where are the skeletons on your network. If they say that there's no skeletons, then they're lying to you. You need to go look harder because there are skeletons in everybody's network. The best thing that we can kind of go from there is understanding, take the threats that they're worried about and kind of compare notes with the report, compare notes with other sources, and figure out what behaviors come from these threats. How do they look in telemetry? Do they spawn processes in certain ways? If so, how can we get tools in place to detect those processes? How can we enable detection? How can we enable investigation? Sooner or later, you're going to run into a false positive wall. How can we bring down those false positives? Is it just as simple as excluding command lines in a SIM? Or do we, have to actually do some sort of log filtering, some sort of parsing to get rid of some of it? And hopefully at the end of all of this, you'll have an idea of how to better spend your time, spend your investments. At the end of all this, you may decide that you no longer need that $2 million appliance that everybody hates to work on and doesn't want around anymore. It may be that, you need to get rid of the $2 million appliance and then use that $2 million to help boost up your personnel, boost up the training, and boost up the people in your organization. So it's going to be a really educational adventure for you. It's going to be a really good time for you to expand, how your organization works.
So what I'm hearing is we should all hug our architects and engineers virtually as they try to, again, prioritize. What do you collect? How do you get that visibility? Not an easy role. So thank you so much, Tony. And another, theme I'm hearing is we need to communicate across these different teams. So moving on to leaders who have to empower their teams, talk to their analysts and architects. Keith, you talked to a ton of CISOs, leaders of organizations. What would you say to them on how they should use this report?
Yeah, I think there's a couple ways to think about it, and I think the awesome news is we've kind of hit on both of them in depth in a number of areas here. Like one, the first thing I always like to think about is leaders are not just executives, right? You might be an executive leader who's responsible for organizational risk management and information assurance, but this is equally applicable. And it's just as important to think about, how should leaders of technical or operations teams use this? And I think, perfect segue in, right? The goal of a leader is to, establish a vision, get everyone aligned behind that, and then help make a plan to execute, right? And like you just said, just talking to one another and making sure that, your detection engineers aren't building use cases that don't provide great context to an analyst. And that when everyone, if your analysts say, hey, we need to detect this thing, and your architect says, well, we don't have the money to collect the data that you need to see it, right? As a leader, I think those are the types of, those are maybe the most important things that you can do, not just with this report, but with attack as a framework. And, as you look to operationalize those things together, right? Just understanding how all this fits together, how you assign value to data, how you prioritize your work, and then making sure that when and how to use these things to measure, right? Either very mechanically, understanding whether you're building the right detection coverage and making good progress, but also again at a high level, are you using this to measure and understand those big trends? Are you going to see the next trick bot coming? Just based on the data and the way you've built your program and the way that your intelligence team digests and communicates that. So extremely valuable in a bunch of ways, I think, to leaders of all types, and kind of definitely a nice way to to think about how no matter what type of team you lead, you take all of this stuff that we just talked about, how can you tie it up in a nice little bow, a nice neat little bow, for the people that you lead and work with directly. So that, no matter the level, everyone's getting better, right?
That's what it's all about, empowering teams, prioritizing and getting better, improving security. So great point to wrap it up on, Keith. So a couple takeaways we want you to walk away from as we start to wrap up the webinar. First off, read the report. We've talked about it, so we're going to be pasting into the chat for you all a link to that report that you can dive in. And the key here, really think about what the trends that we've talked about, how those compare to your own organization. So prioritize the things that threats are doing, those trends we talked about, but then maybe it's a little bit different for your organization. So really take a look at what we have and then apply that to where maybe your visibility gaps are, where you need to improve your detection. So with that, those are some key takeaways for you. Lastly, we wanted to thank you all so much for coming. As we said, this is a tough time for a lot of people, so we appreciate you thinking about the threat detection report, hanging with us. Thank you so much to the rest of the Red Canary team. Of course, so many people contributed to this report, so we appreciate that. As we've talked about throughout the webinar, this is meant to be living. It's on a website, so our hope is to be able to change it throughout the year, update it with new things we talked about, maybe impact will change. We'll also be doing different things. We have a follow-up blog post we're planning, so for any questions we can't get to, we'll hang out for a little bit to address a few of those, but any questions we don't get to, we'll try to address those there. We have deep dive webinars on attack tactics, our blog you can subscribe to as well. And as we mentioned, the recording, we'll send that out early next week for everyone, so you can share it with your friends, your teammates, so you can read the threat detection report and take action based on it. So with that, we're about at the top of the hour. We're going to wrap up officially, but I know Tony at least was kind of interested. We had a couple questions coming in, so let's scroll through those. If you want to hang out with us for another 5-10 minutes, please do. Otherwise, have a great day. So let's dive into some of the questions. We had one on Cobalt Strike. So someone asked, any observations on Cobalt Strike usage during our response engagement or what we're seeing this year? So Tony, I know you wanted to dive into that one.
Absolutely. So that one was the question that caught my eye, where Cobalt Strike was actually something that helped facilitate process injection being a #1 spot this year, because we commonly see Cobalt Strike beacons being injected into Run DLL32, Windows error reporting processes, things like that. And guess what? Those are all missing command line options when it does that. And that's actually kind of one of the key things that we end up looking at is if we start seeing Run DLL32 or Windows error reporting spawning from PowerShell and it has no command line, more often than not, that's probably going to be a Cobalt Strike beacon for us. And as we kind of look into it more, than more often than not, that turns out to be a case of, yes, that's Cobalt Strike injecting shell code into a process. So that's definitely something that helped facilitate this year. And another thing to add into that is where Cobalt Strike has made some things interesting in some engagements this year. There have been some engagements where we've seen multiple adversaries in the same environment. There have been, in one corner of the network, we have an ad fraud operation. In the other corner, we have ransomware burning. And then in the third corner, we have Cobalt Strike sitting on a sensitive record server of some kind. So that's definitely something that we do see, and it's definitely something to plan about. Maybe in your organization, if you have an IR plan, maybe you need to figure out, like, what do I do if I have multiple adversaries at the same time in the same incident?
Keith, any thoughts on this one?
No specific thoughts on Cobalt Strike other than just, Tony hit it right. It's like it is, I would say the way I've always thought about Cobalt Strike is it's really unique in that it is it's an incredibly powerful tool that, not specific to any one technique or even tactic. It is constantly evolving and is like a really good source of what you can expect to see and think of as emerging adversary techniques. So that's, it's not very tactical, but I think at a high level, like Cobalt Strike is one of those tools that you're very wise to keep your eye on and understand. And, whether it's a red team or something else, you should expect to see it and be prepared.
And we will table the offensive security tools debate because we don't have time for that. So just a couple other questions for those who are hanging out. We got one on lull bins, living off the land type things, and talking about how you struggled when doing endpoint detections. Like, is it bad or is it good? Who wants to dive into this one? Brian, I'll come to you first. I'm sure everyone has thoughts about this. How do we detect bad use of good tools, if you will?
Yeah, so part of the question was about if we detect them with any degree of prevalence. So I'll speak to that, and then I'll let Keith take the follow-up question to that. And the answer is absolutely yes. I just quickly perused through the top 20, and I think you could argue that 5 of the top 20, so a full quarter of them, or more than a quarter of them, I'm sorry, are actually exactly a quarter of them, sorry, math live is hard, are arguably lull bins. So yes, we detect them a lot. We have lots of methods of detecting them. And then Keith, you can probably follow up on that.
Yeah, I would say Tony will definitely have the more tactical and useful advice here. I will we're sitting here watching the questions flow by, and this is a fascinating topic, right? There were a couple of overlapping questions, one specific to lull bins, and one prior to that, which is just, hey, how do you take something like PowerShell, which is an administrative tool that we rely on to operate our network, so we can expect to see it happen thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions of times a day. How do you find the time that, how do you find the one or two that are bad? And I think that's, like I said, Tony, I think you be able to dive into a couple of specific use cases, but at a really high level for us, that is probably the most challenging and unique problem we've ever had to solve. In that it is, you're trying to detect misuse of something that not only you can't turn off, but that you have to expect to happen all the time. And in general, the strategy there is this is an overused term, or maybe not overused, but it's usually used in a dismissive way. As we consider it the basics, which may be basic but are really hard, is baselining, right? So, the good news is there are easy ways to do baselining, right? So particularly if you're collecting telemetry, just sometimes it's as simple as, I'll give the broad strategy, which is, take a look figure out how to extract that, million or the 100,000 or whatever Excel will bear, put it into a spreadsheet, deduplicate them, and count them, and then just start with the ones that happen the least frequently, right? And like that is like both a decent detection and baselining strategy. That's also like a perfectly good start at threat hunting. And so I don't know, Tony, if you've probably have some more specific context there.
So when it comes to PowerShell, anything living off the lands, binaries or scripts, anything like that, we typically kind of come to a fork in the road. There are things that are possible to happen. There are things that are very possible, like hypothetical situations, but there are also very clear-cut, malicious, documented uses of applications. There are many ways to download things in Windows. There are many ways to execute things in Windows. But the best thing that you can do to get started with all of this is to focus your 80% of effort on what has been publicly documented. Focus on, what do we know law bins have been used? What do we know PowerShell has been used for? And don't worry about chasing all the hypothetical uses until after you get that 80% done. That's going to be your last 20% that's going to take up and eat up so much of your time that it's ridiculous. As for judging, the difference between evil use, administrative use, that's something that we, honest to goodness, struggle with every day. That's something that there's a reason in Red Canary detections that there's a suspicious category, because there's sometimes that we're not entirely sure if this is an admin or if this is a bad guy, but it just doesn't look right. So let's ask the question. And that's something that you're going to end up finding in your environment too. Once you've started kind of going down the lines of what PowerShell things do I need to look for, maybe it's command lines that include download string, maybe it's things like that where you can prove that PowerShell is being used as a download cradle or something else. Those are going to be your clear cut, okay, we know that this is probably bad, not entirely good. And then your other parts of this will, that's going to be clearly defined admin activity. And then most of your time is going to be devoted into that suspicious category where you're not really sure and you have to answer the question. And the best advice I can give for that is don't be afraid to ask questions. Because if you assume that it's an admin and it's not, there is always a possibility that it's not. And that, that's something that may be happening on your network. And one final thing to kind of close up with law bins is that we kind of tend to tackle as a community law bins thinking that they happen in a vacuum. Like I want to detect print.exe downloading something. Let's back up, let's wait a minute here. Print.exe has to be used to meet an adversary need of some kind. If that adversary need is to download something, they already have to have code execution another way. So that provides you at least 2 or 3 more opportunities to detect an adversary before that law bin is used. So it doesn't just happen in a vacuum. There's an entire chain of things that happens, and every step that an adversary takes is another opportunity for you to detect them.
Great points, and great points to end on, Tony. Adversaries don't happen in a vacuum. Look at what's happening around that execution, but distinguishing good from bad isn't always easy. Good thing, a lot of recommendations, as Brian showed you way back in the beginning, on ideas in the report on how you can distinguish good from bad, weed out those false positives. So again, thank you all so much for joining us. We'll wrap it up there. We have a bunch of other good questions. We could talk for 3 more hours, but in the interest of time, we'll address those in a blog post coming out soon. So again, reach out to us, let us know, what you're seeing. The conversation doesn't end here. So thank you all so much for joining us. Stay well, and we hope to see you next time. Take care.